Thank you very much. Just a little about myself. I know I've got 7 minutes. I planned for 10. Thank you. I'm a criminologist at University of East London, and my research is mostly on sort of forms of violent racism and their relationship to mainstream racisms. And so I work on both hate crime and predominantly the far right. Just to sort of some boilerplate stuff. As we all know, there's been a rise in hate crime in the sort of past 3 years. A lot of the surveys and data puts it as a post-Brexit phenomenon. This was on the rise prior to Brexit, and we can't ignore the way in which racist scapegoating had informed and legitimized that. This has been hate crime, racist hate crime against immigrants, Muslims, and that's been on that tends to also go on the rise, as Naj mentioned, following terrorist attacks. Homophobic, transphobic hate crime, as well as hate crime against disabled people. Now, we also know this week there's been 2 major incidents, one in Germany and one in Regent's Park. And these major incidents can often be taken as individual acts, seen as extreme cases that should indicate that we need to pay attention to this problem, but often are used to distract from the everyday hate, racism, et cetera, that may occur on the street and online. And I could also sort of talk later about the relationship between the two. It's important to note, I use the word hate. I think it's a very problematic term. It's an umbrella term to cover a range of things. I think that if we're going to talk about hate crime, and we're going to talk about hate, we need to talk very specifically about racisms, about homophobia, about sexism and misogyny, about ableism, and the intersection between them. Because if you umbrella them in a term such as hate, which is fairly generalized, flattens the phenomenon, you can't actually get to the root of it or combat it. Now, I also want to say, as we talk about hate crime, we talk about often violent incidents that harm people. These can often be intimate engagements of one individual and another. They can also be informed by not only individuals, but organized hate, such as in the form of the far right. But it's really important not to individualize that or to make it out as if it's an extreme phenomenon. We need to remember the mainstream. This is the mainstream media, political elites, and, as we all know, academics who are justifying anti-immigrant xenophobia and Islamophobia. The mainstream normalizes, legitimizes, and emboldens individuals and organizations who attack people on the streets and attack people online. When I talk about the mainstream, I'm talking about the representation of anti-immigrant xenophobia as the will of the people, or the demos. The liberal racism that says we cast aside the fascism of the past, the National Front, Oswald Mosley, the Nazis, and we're just against the way a certain culture operates or thinks, and tries to naturalize and normalize their racism by appealing to liberal virtues and values. I think Naj spoke about that in terms of gendered Islamophobia most acutely. Media legitimization of both anti-immigrant discourses, as if that's a legitimate view, but also platforming racists. I mean, BBC Question Time has platformed a failed singer who wants to attack the concept of white privilege. It is platformed, this is BBC, ITV, Sky, etc. Steve Bannon, Nigel Farage, Tommy Robinson, even under the idea of liberal democratic values that we need to share the diversity, not of people, but of ideas, bringing in fascists on TV and on legitimate platforms, which in terms legitimizes their views. And we see, I think everyone who's online has seen this video circulating of a woman talking about immigration facts that are absolute horrendous lies, and the BBC has not apologized for the harm this causes to migrants, to people who are targeted, or the fact that by putting it up there, it legitimizes this view as the will of some. Also the construction of legitimate debate, the idea that we have a debate and we have two sides of a debate. There are not two sides of a debate in racism. There's not racism and anti-racism, and we're going to work this out. But it often takes place under the auspices of free speech. We don't have free speech. There is incitement to racial hatred. Free speech also doesn't come without responsibilities, but it's also the construction of a false binary between racism and anti-racism. There are a lot of people who are anti-racist, a lot of people who are on the sharp end of racism, who have a variety of interpretations of what causes it, how to stop it. That's a diversity of views, but that's not the diversity of views that's being placed there. You're either on one side of the argument or the other, as if they're equal. There's also the denialism, the way in which people are picking apart the increase in hate crime statistics, which is a really interesting one because a lot of the denialism comes about. It says the reason there's a rise in hate crime is because more people are complaining, because more people are being encouraged to complain. It's the same as the food bank one. More people go to food banks because they know about them, which is obviously nonsense. But the idea is that the hate crime stats argument is, as a criminologist who works in the area, is quite fascinating to me. We know historically there's been underreporting. Sorry, that was weird. There's been underreporting. That was emphasis. There's been underreporting. So at worst case scenario, we're at a sort of a recognition of the reality. So even if you think they haven't risen, you're likely, if there's more reporting, to get an accurate reading than an overdetermined reading. And just a few more, and I guess the other one, I just want to wrap it up, because I know time's going, is, actually it's worth going, because I mentioned Lawrence Fox. One of the ways of legitimizing hate is the representation of historically dominant identities as marginalized and in needing a say. Okay, and then I'll end with state racism, and then state hate. And this is a really important one. The way the states, the politicians' policies, ideas, and personalities legitimize the very hate that then gets blamed on individuals on the street, who may embody it, but are not legitimizing it. They're enacting it. The state, in terms of, to go back to what Ruth was mentioning, austerity, and the way that intersects with inequalities that the people who are targeted often occupy the positions of. There is the go-home vans, hostile environment, deportations, letterbox comment, and more recently, in terms of sort of the very illiberal specter of fascism, which allegedly is gone, race science and eugenics in number 10. And I'll leave it there.